Hey YouTube, what's going on? Dustin Dolby here. Just wanted to drop you a quick workflow and say thank you for helping us hit 50K to the people who joined the party. Make sure to subscribe below, hit the bell. So today we're running through a pretty easy workflow, just shooting a simple dynamic advertising scheme with a couple speedlights. So I threw this together last night. It's a pretty dynamic cosmetic advertising look, I thought. I see this a lot in advertising, and in one form or another, I see this style replicated a lot across the internets. If we take a look at this and think what characterizes a dark look like this is having nice bright white light, carving it off the background confidently. I think that looks really, really pretty with a black background, or virtually black background. So I invoked my own flavor to this shoot by adding pixels in the background. But this is a real template-based look from which you can spice it up and add your own flavor. And no matter how you choose to edit yours, if you create anything and you're comfortable sharing it, I'm dying to see it. Post it below in our Facebook group. I love seeing all the stuff you guys are making. So if I can just say one more quick word about this style, we are showing 1.5 of the product, which kind of poses a unique problem. Like you see, they are confidently lit all the way down, which I think looks attractive, and they're not casting a shadow on one another. And that's because I chose to shoot these separately. And that's just a cognizant decision I made because I feel really comfortable stitching things back together in Photoshop. And I appreciate the sort of benefits of being able to shoot each one separately and get really cozy next to the product and make sure the lighting's nice. So I'll run you through the post-production workflow as well, but if you have a different way you'd shoot this or have any comments or questions, leave them below. I'm dying to hear, and I'll definitely get back to you. So without further ado, why don't we dive in here? We're gonna be using Yongnuo speedlights, which I usually use, but you can use any kind of speedlights, and I'll link a bit of gear in the description that I like to use for this kind of stuff. So you see how it's mounted. And it's really free form, but there's the potential for it to be crooked. So I made sure to straighten it as much as possible. And I'm just using a Stripbox and just shooting it right at it. I'm not gonna use this exposure, but I'm gonna get a good read on if it's straightened or if it's crooked. Great, so this simple exposure tells us a lot. I mean, look at how the cap is reacting in a more glossy manner. Like we're getting a direct reflection as compared to the more matte base, which is diffusing the light upon contact. But in terms of it being crooked, I think we're within the ballpark. You can always turn a curves layer on really quickly just to get a read on if your product's straight or not. I usually use the brand names or something that you believe to be centered. But you can zoom in and really analyze this. And I think we're within striking distance here. We'll make a few more small adjustments as we wrap more light around the front of the product. We'll really be able to see or even measure little distances to make sure we're straight as an arrow to give ourselves no headache in post-production. Notice how we're bowing up here. This line where the cap meets the product is straight if you look at it completely dead on. So since it's bowing up, that tells us that we're looking somewhat up in the product, which I've mentioned in previous workflows, sometimes has a positive connotation, like you're looking up at it in esteem. So let's keep this train moving. Please comment below, let me know what you guys are shooting with. I'm under the impression a lot of people who watch this might use speedlights, but I know there's some more professional shooters out there using strobes and whatnot. It really doesn't matter what you use as much as people tend to think. Light is light to some degree. It helps to be able to modify it in a flattering way, which is why I often use strip boxes and things like that. Like a strip box is really nice for an edge light. What I'm gonna go for here is just shooting the light kind of right at the edge of the product, and hopefully it'll carve it out on a pretty catalog backdrop, right? Let's take a little look here. Let's take a quick look at this, and nice, it goes right from the bottom, right up. Some of the color bleeds through, but it looks really classy and cuts it out. Maybe you could go a little higher up the top of the cap. We do get a bit of flare coming in from the side. This can be really sensitive whenever you're shooting a light towards your camera. You can get negative optical phenomena. So I'm just gonna turn this a little, pivot it just a little bit past and try to shoot it past the lens rather than in it, which hopefully will help us out here. I think I might need a new battery for my remote. That's what you get for using a $1 remote, right? I'll link that in the description as well. Nice. Our edge light got a little weaker. And I want to raise it a little bit higher, but I really like how we got rid of the flare there. So I'll raise it up, and why don't I just pre-key that so you guys can check it out. And as that comes in, you'll see that hopefully creep up the shoulder. Yeah, that looks nice. And you can always tweak this once you reintroduce other lights, but it's good to have a handle on it when it's isolated because it's isolated and you can really get a good read on it. Yeah, and that pretty much comes down to personal preference, just setting up my edge light first. I think that really accrues value throughout your shoot because it provides a constant flattering light source to kind of give you a vision, let you see the end of the tunnel and get direction as to where the shoot is headed. So I'll leave that on for a second, and it's a great option to have. And I'm gonna bring in a second strip box with a Yongnuo Speedlight in it. So the same kind of economic system here. With a Speedlight Adapter, of course, going into that strip box. I'll make sure to link those goodies below this video if you're curious and you wanna check it out. So I'm just gonna shoot this dead on to our product. We don't have a modeling light, and we kind of have an idea of what this light's gonna look like from our test shot, but we will just discuss and modify it as we go. And it should be fairly simple, and it's really gonna pay off having this mounted on this wire like this, as you're gonna see in a moment, because we'll get really cozy right next to the product. So here's a nice harsh light, like pretty much fired right at it. And that's pretty serious, right? Zoom in here. See the body? I kind of like how the highlight accented the brand name. And as I look down here, the harsh light's not too shabby, especially with that rim light cutting it out. It looks really nice. If we move up here towards the top, you see the cap sort of reinforced our suspicion that this glossy material is going to need some special TLC. It's going to need something other than just a harsh light put on it, because it's just spitting that light right back at us with a direct reflection. And I don't think that's flattering enough. And if we're going for such a stylized look anyway, we might as well, spend the time to flatter each material, including the kind of glossy cap. I'm just turning off our back strip box real quick, just so we can focus on the front light a bit, and then we'll reintroduce it. So we're gonna use a diffuser to kind of augment the lighting and make it look more flattering. You can build your own diffuser, and I have a tutorial on our channel how to build one. It's a really rewarding experience because it's a really high quality solution, because you can use thicker diffusion materials when compared to, say, like one of these nylon panels, which I often use here on this channel, but they're not as thick. I'll use one today because everyone seems to have one of these lying around. They're in those 5-in-1 reflection packs, and it's a pretty versatile option if you don't mind maybe doubling up the thickness or just paying special attention to making sure, the thinness of the diffusion material isn't causing us any ugly highlights. So why did I bring this out? Well, we're gonna use it to catch the light and try to flatter the cap a bit more. So I'm gonna create a gradient by sort of shooting this at the back at a 45-degree angle. And hopefully that'll lighten up this diffusion panel and make the cap look a little more flattering. Look at this pretty close. And just sort of pivot it. And I can kind of look down the chute here, so I think it's going to be, a reasonable position to start tweaking it. But this is gonna be a back to front sort of classical gradient, almost reminiscent of like a wine lighting technique or something like that. In fact, it's a bit like our tutorial how to photograph classic wine with speedlights. And let's see, it's a classic look. Let's check it out. Right on, so I'll zoom in here and we see it's a very different experience to what's happening on the cap compared to the more bare light. Like it's still reflecting directly, but it's reflecting a softly lit diffusion panel. So it's an interesting look left to right. We still have some nice contour in the edge down here. And I often find when you're photographing such small items, the little adjustments will make a huge difference in terms of the quality of your gradient. So I often will just, even if the scheme looks nice, just move the strip box around and get an idea of the parameters of how I can light this thing. Like moving it back will already have a pretty pronounced effect. Look at that. And yeah, it actually helps better define some of the contour at the bottom. If I zoom in, you see there's almost an edge light quality appearing on the left-hand side, and that's nice. Right, pretty clean. So that's a good example of something we could do with like a back to front light. And obviously we could do some more adjustments there to improve it a little bit. Let's go for something a little more edgy, and we're gonna do a front to back gradient, in to out. So I'm gonna turn the strip box around, and I'm gonna line it up with our diffusion material, and in a similar way, we're still going to shoot light across the diffusion material, but it's gonna change the direction of the gradient going from the inside perspective to the outside. And I'm gonna straighten this a little bit so we get a nice clean line to our gradient. And that looks pretty nice. And you know what, why don't we fire off a quick test shot? I think I just bump this a little bit. We'll turn that back on, we'll get it firing again, but for right now, I really just wanna focus on the gradient. Cool, so you see such a bold difference, and this really isn't an apples to apples comparison, because we should brighten this exposure. And to do it justice, we should have it at the proper setting. So I'll turn this light up, maybe move it a bit more towards the center. Wish us luck. And now we can do a more even comparison. Nice, so that's pretty bright. You see that's a little more edgy than the left to right look. They're both acceptable, they're different looks, and we're going for almost like a futuristic mood to our final scheme here. So I think the in to out gradient's actually kind of appropriate here, so I'll keep going in that direction, but just know there's a lot of different options at your fingertips, and you can get pretty wild with gradients. Let's zoom in here and take a little look at the quality of our gradient. Not too bad with that nylon diffusion material. And yeah, we definitely have a bright sort of concentrated area on the right, and then it fades off to the left. And we could further adjust this for, a ton of time. We could spend time tweaking this, but I actually like this, as is pretty well. I like how we're really brightening the brand name as well. Why don't we get that back edge light kicking again, because that might sort of complete the story. And hope you're seeing the intrinsic value and keeping everything static. Because now we can just turn this on. Beautiful, it's gonna scream at me a little bit. I'll actually pre-key our previous exposure. I wanna fire this off, and we'll see that update live in front of your eyes there. And how nice is that? We're actually getting a bit of flare still from the right, but it's nowhere near the actual body of our product, so it should be okay. Let's zoom in here. And again, we see a similar quality, obviously, but with that edge light. And as I touched on earlier, it really benefits us by giving the edge confidence. A lot of people might use another light in this scenario. Of course, a bounce card is perfectly appropriate, especially because we're not trying to match the brightness on the other side of this product symmetrically. We're just trying to do more of like a 4:1 or a 3:1 lighting ratio, which organically will happen just because of the power fall off using a piece of card, for instance. So let's take a few fills here. Just try to gauge where we're at, because if you look at the product as is, it looks cool, it looks edgy, but the other side is sort of underwhelming. And since we are on a black background, we don't want to underwhelm our subject into the depths of darkness, which sounds like a Harry Potter movie. Let's do this. Even something subtle like that. That was actually kind of beautifully subtle. Because you can overwhelm, the reflection, we all know that. You can make it intense, but sometimes you will wash out a bit of your detail doing that. You lose a certain quality by almost approaching making it symmetrical. Like if you're gonna make it symmetrical, really do it and set up both lights, both diffusers, and make it mathematically symmetrical. But if I zoom in here, I'm not a big fan of too harsh of a fill. It doesn't look horrible, but it's more like a 2:1 lighting ratio, and we lost a lot of the detail down here in the body. I'm seeing a bit of dust maybe I should get rid of, but we're seeing a lot of loss of detail. I can't really tell that edge sort of swoops over. So sometimes I'll even back up the back up the fill just a little bit to leave little gaps of shadow in where maybe you can catch some detail. Like if I pre-key that, I wasn't too close to it here, maybe I'll back it up a hair. And that's actually a great example. Let's zoom into this here and see how just by backing it up, I kind of reintroduced a shadow where I wanted it to be. I still suffocated the highlight up top. So what I'm just trying to explain is there's a real spectrum of distances you can use, to get different reflection detail from your base exposure. And make the decision, or just arm yourself with a ton of different data, so when you bring this up in the editing room, you can really see what's going on. Now, sometimes I'll get a bit of like a suffocation exposure, and what I mean by that is I'll really sort of bring in the diffuser, the fill, and I'll try to create like a vortex between the lens and the product. This will be overkill in terms of the actual data. It'll look really bright, and I'm not sure I'm looking for this look as I discussed earlier. But sometimes I'll take this just to serve the potential purpose later of giving me label info. Let me quickly unpack what I mean by that. If you lower the black point, because we're shooting in RAW, right? So if you lower your black point in post-production, it will crush all the shadow values and take them really deep and dark. Now that's a deep, sultry look. It's not what I'm going for, but it'll serve a purpose, because now we can raise the white values as well in post-production. So we're essentially creating a ton of contrast. Now I don't think this looks nice, but let me show you what you can do. You can lower the exposure incrementally then in your RAW editing program. And once you lower the exposure, you'll eventually fade to this magical point. Let me zoom in here, where it almost looks like CGI, because you've completely crushed out the body of the cosmetic, but you've left yourself with, in effect, a perfect render frame for a label. And you could add this in on lighten mode and it would, like butter, introduce that into your whole scheme. You know, if you've been following our channel here for a while, and shout out to everyone who has been, you know, you probably know we like using little tricks to beef up our production value here and there. So that's one small instance of that. Obviously there is a spectrum between, you know, spending a lot of time compositing and getting this done in one exposure. And you can choose where on the spectrum your personal style leaves you. But I'm definitely confident having that up our sleeve, because if you're even lukewarm comfortable in Photoshop, I mean, that's a 2-second thing you could add to your label just to make it perfect. So I'm gonna shoot the applicator, but I have to head out. So what I'm gonna do is leave all of this set up, and then I'm gonna come back and shoot the applicator. Here, I'll serve you the renders right now. I'll be shooting from that. And you can take a look at them. It'll be the exact same lighting scheme. In fact, I'll make sure to break it down single light by single light, because it's just the edge light, just like before. And then we introduce the gradient, and that's as simple as just turning those lights back on and off. And then we'll introduce some fill options. So it's the exact same story. In fact, we won't have to adjust any lights. We'll just have to adjust the applicator itself, which should be no problem. Like, we already know the applicator is gonna look good because we already shot it kinda. Like, it's the same cap that's in the body right now. So it makes sense that in our future exposures, it looks similar and responds similarly to the light. In terms of the actual applicator, we'll just clean it off as best we can. And then look at it, it's a glossy black material. So yes, the edge light's gonna look good. Yeah, the center gradient's gonna look groovy. And the fill is gonna just be beautiful and help, again, carve it out, because it's similar materials to what we've already shot. So it's almost a no-brainer. It's just as simple as turning the metal wire around, cleaning off the applicator, and shooting it. So I did use hot glue gun to mount this up. I simply just applied hot glue to the back of the applicator on a wire and just let that sit with a clamp grabbing it down. So that made it sort of bake in really strongly. The alternative would be, as I said, obviously use a shooting surface, which is rock solid, so it'll give you a consistent horizon line and sort of make things more uniform. But like I said, you may have trouble bringing in your lights this cozy next to your product if you're using a shooting surface, which is why we are just free falling over here. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay guys, so I'm gonna grab all those exposures. I'll catch you on the other side here in post-production. Hopefully you enjoyed the tutorial so far. We'll throw this together pretty simply. And like I said, if you have any questions, leave them below because I'll get back to you. And I'll catch you on the flip side. Okay guys, so we're hanging out here inside of Photoshop, and I've determined our 2 standalone exposures are completely acceptable for compositing here. We don't need any additional layer, so I'm still happy I showed you those tricks, but the native contrast in this exposure is already ridiculously juicy, so we don't need that trick up our sleeve, but I'm still happy I showed you it for maybe another application where you're struggling. Whenever possible, I like to minimize my workflow, obviously, right? Just keeps things a bit more simple. The applicator's a little bit trickier than the body, and we're going to be cutting both out, which should be pretty easy considering we're already virtually in a catalog black environment, though the applicator, which we will bring up for visual interest, will be like 10% harder. So I'll start with the body here, and we'll keep it relatively simple as we go. Now this will need a little bit of cleaning, but I'm going to start off just by building a selection around my product. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. The pen tool being the high quality option. Polygonal lasso tool is probably in second place. Then there's the magnetic lasso tool, which normally I avoid. And for a quick tutorial, it actually may serve us pretty well if I just sort of draw it around our product with a frequency of 57, which is an arbitrary number, but it seems to be working here. And little areas like this, I may even click to set an anchor, click again. So when you begin to do a magnetic lasso tool, you're not locked into a treacherous amount of micro movements. You can always hit space, grab the frame, move it around, get comfortable again, and then when you let go, it again will track to the side of the product. So obviously, like I said, the environment the product's sitting in incentivizes this tool because it's really effortless for it to sort of detect where the edge is, even though I'm a little bit shaky here. I had a couple coffees this morning, but it's doing a pretty good job. And even if it's off a smidge, you understand in a more professional context, you'd fix that up or probably just jump at this with the pen tool. But as long as you can get a fairly sound selection, this will start taking form in front of our eyes here. This selection's not make or break because it'll essentially be on a black background anyway. So if our selection's bleeding out or feathering out a pixel, it's not the end of the world. And normally I make these selections before I start these tutorials, but today I just thought I'd grab this one live just to show you what goes on behind the scenes here at workphlo. And holding control, I'll finish that selection. So I'm not going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for that selection, but it's half solid. So what I'm going to do here is actually just hit this button while the selection's present, and that will mask it out. Now it looks a little choppy at the bottom, and I'm sure you all spot areas I could improve, but I'll kind of just keep this train moving. I'll paste black in, and you see it's a little bit forgiving when it is on a black background. Now I will need to do the same thing with the applicator, but before I do that, I want to start giving this whole scene a bit of shape and a bit of form. So what I'll start by doing is actually creating a reflection from here. So what I'm going to do is hit Control J and duplicate this layer, but I'm actually going to apply, right click and apply the layer mask. Now when I hit Control T to scale it, the bounding box will be around the product rather than the whole canvas, which is just nice. It's just more comfortable. And if you actually hit down here on the anchor, you can anchor at the bottom, right click, flip vertical, and you'll pretty much see a reflection emerge. Now it's not perfect. I'm going to use the up keys to nudge it up a little bit closer to my product and make sure it's underneath in terms of layer stacking. It makes no sense if your reflection's sort of peering above it if it is off a little bit. Now let's turn down the opacity. And like I said, the reason I do this is just so I can look at this, and now it's kind of clicking in my brain as I'm seeing a deeper space. I'm not looking at a flat Photoshop canvas for the time being. And we'll keep implementing things to increase the perception of that depth, like some color in the background, for instance. And this is why I like doing this stuff digitally. If you hit I, you can grab your exact color from your product. So I'm going to make a new layer below my reflection. And for the time being, actually, I'm going to turn the reflection up 100% just so I can see what I'm doing behind it. And I'm going to make a gradient in this background. I'll hit G to bring up my gradient tool, and we will actually do a radial gradient, which sounds counterintuitive, but I will make a simple radial gradient, something like that. I'll hit Control T. Holding Alt, I will shrink it such that it becomes relatively thin. So now you'll see a radial concentrate in the middle, and it'll fade off towards the edges, which looks kind of nice and futuristic and techy. I'm going to put this behind our product, and where you place this is going to sort of tell your brain where the horizon line is. I'm going to put it a little bit above the product to suggest maybe the product's approaching being near the end of the table. I'm going to, still holding Alt, drag outwards now, and we can actually curve down on our actual product. So this is starting to take a bit of form. Something I might do with a reflection, like, pardon me, a gradient like this, is duplicate it, which will, increase its brightness. You can hit Control T and you can shrink it again. This will give you, more variation, and it can lead to different shapes, different concentrations appearing in your glow, which is kind of cool. The snap's stopping me from going wild here, so I'm going to take that off and really try to do a really thin one and make it even more concentrated. One thing I also might want to do actually is fade out our reflection towards the bottom. So why don't we actually give this a mask? To bring out our gradient, I'll go to a linear gradient. I'll bring black as my foreground color, and I will fade black from here with a straight line holding shift to here, which I'll let go of that. And there you go. And that corresponds with the shape of the mask, of course. So why don't we bring in the applicator from here? Now we're still on a catalog black background. So you might say to yourself, why would we even need to select out, the applicator or everything going on up here, which may be a little more squirrely? Well, it's because background elements might cross through that. So we want to have it rendered off the background so that if we do want to have a background element parallax past it, which can add believability, we have that option. But we will still use a fairly garbage selection with the magnetic lasso tool, and I'll show you where I'd bolster it if need be. So I'm going to zoom in here. And let's hope we can do another 60-second selection here, because that's pretty ungodly in the realm of product photography. But let's do this. So we're following along up the edge here. It's looking pretty good. I'll let go here. And I do love hitting space and readjusting. Being comfortable while you're making selections is pretty important. And knowing you can hit the backspace key at any moment is nice. Now you see there's so many intricate grooves going on here, but what I'm going to do is just completely ignore it and just on aggregate take the shape of this. In fact, I'll make a node here, a node there. I'll probably bolster that a little bit. And this sloppiness has nothing to do with being in a rush or just making a YouTube tutorial. I really would start with a garbage selection here and just refine it as necessary, depending on what goes in our background. So we'll hit backspace to get rid of that. We're looking pretty good here. Nice. And we'll finish that up right there beautifully. So same workflow as last time. We'll actually bring this into the canvas and hit that button to give it a mask real quick. Let's turn on everything else we have going on here. And there's your final image, guys. So leave me a comment below. No, of course, this isn't your final image. We're going to move the applicator out a little bit here. to make it a little more believable, we won't put it right behind our product. So you see, we have a stacking problem. There you go. Obviously, you need any background elements in the background. And as we see, since we have a selection here, we can actually move this above our applicator. And with some degree of certainty, we can move it in front of it. And that's nice. Now, if we were to move this in front of this, we'll immediately notice the error of our sins. But if we're putting it over here where we selected with a high degree of confidence, especially with 0.8 pixels of feather, it's going to look half decent. Now, in this sort of scenario, you might want to use an area where it's going to be crossing over and spend the most of your time making sure that aspect of the selection is airtight. So let's move this over. And like I said, it gives a bit of visual interest being out. We still want it to look believable. Like, I don't want to put it at the exact same horizon line if it is in front of it. Maybe I'll stagger it in front slightly. And maybe something like that will start to work. Actually grab all this and sort of center it a bit more. I know in my previous exposure I did a bit of an off-centered vibe, but maybe I'll do this one a little bit different. So same thing as last time for a reflection. Control-J to duplicate. Right-click, apply layer mask, Control-T, right-click, flip vertical. You can drag down if you don't anchor at the bottom. And similarly, I like to drop it safely below and then just use my up and down arrow keys on the computer to nuzzle it in there. And of course, make sure it's underneath our product. Now, the opacity of the other one's 58, so I'll probably want to match that. Great, now let's look at this without our curves layer on so we can see really what's happening. It might not look as attractive from your perspective, but this is the data we're working with, so maybe I'll reduce that a little bit here, just so it's not looking insane. There's certainly a lot of steps we could take to improve this even further, but I think we're at a good starting point for our editing. So this might be a strong point to add in your background element, whether it's pixels or some, visually dynamic element or whatever you want to introduce. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have black as my background color and gray as my foreground color. And I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Clouds. And once again, I'm going to sample our beautiful color here. I'll paste it in that layer. Things are starting to look really weird, but I'll put it as a color layer. And I promise you this is going to look better in a moment. Now what I'm going to do is go to Filter. Where is this now? Pixelate Mosaic. So this is giving me a bit of that like classic sort of digital pixel vibe, and I'm going with 78 size squares, which are okay. Again, I'm just running through this crudely, and that gets us somewhere. Now what I'm going to do is sort of strange because these are very flat squares. If I zoom in, and just to give them a bit of, not edginess, but let me show you what I mean here. I'm just going to sharpen these, which will have a very, very weird effect on them overall. It's an unsharp mask. And you see it kind of contours them towards the middle, which kind of looks cool and suits when I blend them in a sort of subtle way. What I'm going to do now is put this on lighten mode, this cloud pixel layer. And now I'm just going to apply a curves layer to it. So since it's on lighten mode, it can only lighten the underlying layer, which is essentially black. But what I'm going to do here is get these down to a point. And if I pull them down like this, you see they kind of, they drop in a uniform manner. But if I just crush the blacks this way, you see it sort of selectively crushes out different pixels and leaves me with a kind of weird remnants of what's left. And I'm just turning up the contrast to 1,000,000 here and sort of deciding how dense I want these to be. And I may not be in love with these exact pixel shapes. There is a lot of variance to, with the seed you started rendering that cloud image from. And if you repeat this technique, you'll get a lot of different results. But let me just go ahead with this one for the purposes of time and sort of just see how I might place this. Now this can go in combination with a mask. So the only real thing I'm looking for is not having a background element, preferably crossing through the horrible part of our selection, which kind of reveals itself. So I'll kind of leave that area unaffected, but maybe I'll still have some, some nice general pixels floating around the product like this. So let me click this layer with the clouds, I'll hold Alt and hit this button, which will invert it. I'll hit B to bring up my brush, and with a white brush, what I can now begin to do with a larger white brush is paint in where I want those pixels to exist. If you hold Shift and click your mask, it'll disable your mask so you can see what you have to work with. But now you can sort of start to give your frame weight and, put elements behind your product where you actually want it to be. You can also Control-J, Control-T, right click, flip vertical, for instance. Now you've flipped your pixels upside down. So you can, maybe introduce some pixels in a different area or use multiple different layers. So you can begin to do this to wildly change your background. And I just think pixels are one avenue you could go down in terms of a style in your background. This is something I do see a lot in advertising because, like I said, it has a bit of a futuristic flavor, and that's kind of neat. So not that I'm in love with this composition and it's perfect, but I'll just keep moving forward because you understand with the proper time how you could craft this. And if you've been editing products, you know what I mean. You want to have a good visualization of the product when you remove dust off it digitally. In fact, sometimes I'll enhance the brightness while I do, an adjustment like that. But this looks bright enough, so let's go to our body. I'll hit J to bring up my patch tool and we'll zoom in here. And you'll see a bit of dust on the product. Now I'm holding Shift to fix many areas at once, which is a little cruder of a solution, but can work if you're used to, doing this and you're seeing a lot of areas that are candidates to be sampled from. 90% of this cosmetic is clean. Just a few problematic areas I want to probably fix up. And this is the typical rigmarole for editing any photo. Obviously, you want to look for dust and look for areas you can improve. Let's go over to our applicator, which I don't suspect to be filthy. One great piece of gear you can buy is an air blower, like a can of air. Then you have a pressurized air source. You can get all this dust off. And even if the can of air cost $3, because it sounds crazy, right? Buying a can of air. It sounds like the ultimate fool's move, buying a can of air. But if it can save you 10 minutes in your dust retouching workflow, well, then that's an investment in my mind. Okay, one more piece of dust on the body, but these are looking pretty groovy. So now we've retouched that, we can probably do a bit more of an aesthetical crafting in the curves department. And this will also affect the background, so I'll stay wary of that. Maybe I'll crush these to somewhere around here, maybe a little bit brighter. And then the background pixels, maybe I'll be a little bit more lenient here, even though I'm not in love with them. We'll be a little bit more lenient, and we'll let some more bleed through. Maybe something like that, not bad. Bring out my brush and maybe just get rid of these guys over here. So that's like a half decent 2-second buildup of what we did earlier. One other thing I'd look out for, since we are on a dark background, is just bringing out that selective color, which you guys know is a big staple in my workflow personally. And crank all these values down, invert the mask, hit B to bring out your brush, put white as your foreground, and simply just paint on all those white labels to look their best with a selective color adjustment, which is a subtle thing to do, but has a lot of positive benefits. So I went through it pretty crudely, guys, but this is pretty much where I was at last time, and hopefully you can see a lot of the same sort of style elements bleed through. It's a cool look, and this is just 1 degree on a huge compass of styles you can invoke. But it's pretty simple stuff, guys. Comment below and let me know what you think of this, how you think I did in this tutorial. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And it's kind of interesting because we did such a digital heavy solution for this. I'm floating the idea of maybe in the future doing an episode, and let me know what you think of this, honestly, where maybe we try to reproduce a look in camera and then in a digital heavy solution, and we'll sort of weigh the pros and cons of doing each and show you how accurate we could get. Because theoretically, I'll just zoom in here, like you could shoot this in an organic setting. You could be on a black background, right down here near the bottom. You could have this horizon light peek out over a piece of black plexiglass, and you could use some sort of screen element like an iPad or a TV or even just a projection to introduce digital elements to the background like this. So maybe we'll do an episode floating a digital versus a camera solution. Having said that, for styles like this, which are so popular in advertising, I think it's a really good tool to equip yourself with, just having the knowledge to understand these schemes, because they are relatively minimal, and I actually think they lend themselves very well to beginner product photographers. Thank you deeply to the 50,000 of you who subscribe to our channel. In fact, we just blew past 51K, so thank you very much. And as our live streaming progresses and our Facebook group keeps growing, I think we just hit 5,000 members. It should be a really exciting time. Here's to the train to 100K. Wish me luck, guys. Should be a doozy. So yeah, make sure to leave a comment below. Let me know what you want me to shoot next, because I'm dying to hear what you want to shoot. I have some great episodes in the queue, so stay tuned, and I'll make sure to catch you next time, guys. Take care.